Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the Open Grand Final of UADC. On the government team, we have Tokyo 1, and on the opposition team, we have Malaya 1. The motion that is being debated is this House believes that moderate Muslims should refrain from attempting to reclaim the term jihad in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Hello, am I audible?
You are audible.
Great, thank you so much. Asked for POI preference, please do just input it in the chat box. However, if I do not take you by 5 minutes and 30 seconds, please just do let me know verbally. I'll be happy to take you. I'm just going to turn my video on. Just give me a second as well. Hello, hopefully I'm visible as well. Thank you so much for that confirmation. Thank you, everyone. Okay. All right, so I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 points of simple setup before 2 points of simple argumentation. Firstly, what does reclamation look like on our side? It looks like saying that the core of the jihad is not suicide bombings or violence, but rather it is living the good Muslim life that is entailed in the info slide. Secondly, what does it mean? What is the context and the time frame upon which we do this? It is immediately after the terrorist attack, insofar as, for example, there are live streams of the victims and the deaths that are being live streamed, or things, for example, there's lots of confusion and I guess disruption on the ground as well. And that coverage is still something that is being done in that circumstance. I think there's a great deal of confusion that exists directly after these terrorist attacks. But thirdly, we think that what we do instead is that we distance ourselves from jihad explicitly, say that obviously the jihad is against the interests of the Muslim people. And I think this is something very clear thing that we're going to be supporting on our side. 2 arguments. Firstly, why does this entrench discrimination towards Muslims under the status quo? Secondly, why is it comparatively better on our side, and why are we able to garner support for the majority of nonviolent Muslims in the status quo? So firstly, how does this entrench discrimination towards Muslims? We have to understand what the public sentiment looks like right after these terrorist attacks, right? We think it's likely to be in a sense where it's incredibly negative towards these jihadists. 2 reasons for this. Firstly, because I think that terrorist attacks are incredibly scary and it's going to be the main focus on people's lives. Because you have to understand that terrorist attacks being broadcasted suddenly on like some live stream, for instance, is that there is significantly, you're terrified that perhaps these terrorist attacks might be in your vicinity from the perspective of a local person, or that you feel that, you know, your loved ones might be on the list of people who you see who are being live streamed. We think that the fabric of society in of itself is compromised, and there's a significant deal of panic and fear that you feel on a daily basis once these things are being live streamed, right? But secondly, we think that there is incentive for mass media to peddle this and say that jihadists are evil, or that jihadists have committed more terrorist attacks, right? And we have to understand and note that this is likely to be done in the portrayal of the media in a very simplified fashion. 3 kind of reasons for this, sub-reasons for this. Firstly, we think there's significantly limited airtime that, you know, the media has, right? So insofar as you spread the news that, you know, jihadists are done, is that it's very simplified in that, you know, you don't have limited time, so you just have to say that you know, the jihadists have committed those attacks. But secondly, we think that, you know, insofar as the people who control media do not understand the intricacies of the Muslim, or I guess the Islamic faith, means that they're unlikely to delve into the specific nuances or like the specific composition of how like these people perhaps or might be jihadists, but, you know, the vast majority of people aren't jihadists. We don't think they have the like capacity to do that insofar as they don't understand that as well. But thirdly, we think that there's a significantly like incentive for you to portray these issues as black and white. That is that you want to provide immediate relief towards the like general population so they don't cause panic. And so therefore you have the interest as a media organization to portray what is the most soothing for people. And we think that oftentimes that is to say that these jihadists themselves were explicitly bad, to say that this was a result of jihadists who committed these acts of terrorism. Obviously, I think this means that this is an appealing solution. The conclusion of this is that obviously this means that there's a significantly negative perception of jihad. This is associated with suicide bombings and massive destruction that goes on. Before I move on further to my point, short POI.
All right, if the team's stance is to say that we will distance ourselves from jihad immediately post-conflict, at what point of time are you going to explain to the people that jihad is actually a core tenet of Islam?
Obviously, I think I think we have to give a reasonable fiat, but what we're saying is that immediately after the aftermath, as this motion entails, we should not be doing this because it causes more harm than good. I think Tota will deal with these nuances specifically as well. But secondly, how do moderate Muslims try to defend what happens when moderate Muslims try to defend and reclaim this, right? We have to understand what these people look like. These people look like immigrants from Muslim communities to the Western world, for instance, or the Muslim people in the Western state, right? Who believe in Islam, but work in any kind of like sector that is not like necessarily associated. So they're not like really I guess like super into the religion insofar as I think they lead normal lives in like I guess regular industries. So why is it very unlikely for this jihad? Why is it likely that this reclamation is unsuccessful? There are three structural reasons. Firstly, it is because mass media is controlled by people who are majority not Muslim, and as I've explained before, these people have simplified interests, and they try to basically peddle the explanation with the simple explanation that all jihadists are bad, right? Obviously, insofar as moderate Muslims do have some capacity, but they lose overwhelmingly to the majority people because they don't have like the ability to go against it, because they don't own, for example, media like corporations that majority of people subscribe to, means that the megaphone that the majority have is way larger than the voices of these moderate Muslims. Therefore, you're unlikely to be able to convince the majority of people otherwise as well. But secondly, we think that people can't act and understand these complex nuances of jihad in the first place. Because you have to understand, it is quite reasonable for you to be frightened, for you to be shocked and have trauma directly after a terrorist attack. And so therefore, people are likely to believe in the good or bad narrative that these jihadists are either good or bad, and they want immediate answers, right? Therefore, they have like this flight and fight response. They're likely to be defensive and therefore likely to opt in for the choice that is most simplistic, and therefore the ones that like the media narratives say to them, which is that jihadists are overwhelmingly bad. But thirdly, we think that people already have a negative inclination towards the word anyway, right? Because they're unlikely to engage with it meaningfully, because the word jihad is so associated, as is said is implied in the info side. People don't believe that this is something that is like positive for them. The conclusion is that jihad is supposed to be something that is good, but the reclamation fails miserably, and this is bad. But I've only proven to you that this is like neutral, right? Why is it an active harm for these people as well? Two reasons. One, it's because moderate Muslims are now associated with this word, and they're like, in media narratives are likely to pick like, you know, these words out of context. So it's like saying that Muslims, for example, like defend jihadists, and they're likely to pick these words out of context as well. This is incredibly harmful because it furthers and kind of associates the terrorist attacks with the moderate Muslims that exist under the status quo. But secondly, we think that obviously terrorists and jihadists themselves use this to support their rhetoric, and which is a lot more insidious, right? So instead of like the jihadists and like the terrorists saying that, you know, they probably use force, and they try to like adapt the narrative themselves, and they try to manipulate the narrative by saying that, you know, these moderate Muslims agree with us too, and they try to co-opt that narrative because it's a lot easier for them to absorb and confuse the public. The impact of this is that, you know, hate crimes rise because after the immediate like shock and after the immediate terrorist attack, people like kind of are really scared, and therefore they're likely to act upon it, and so therefore there's an active harm towards the Muslim people. Why is it comparatively better on our side? It is for two reasons. One, it's because you distance and differentiate yourself with terrorists, because you actively call them out and you say that they're categorically different from what you were before, right? So therefore, you're able to provide a simple answer to the public that, you know, the moderates and extremists are quite different from you. But secondly, it's that mass media and terrorists cannot misrepresent your words. It's very unlikely because you have a track record of saying that jihadists are people who are against you, and therefore you can actively publish statements by saying which are legitimately believable because, you know, the mass media believes you are like much more believable. So for all those reasons, we think that, you know, we think that this provides a very simple narrative for these jihadists for regular people to understand. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible, please?
Yes, you're audible. I'd like to welcome the yellow.
Right, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, when right-wing media portrayed Islam as a religion of hate, we were not silent. When al-Baghdadi said that Islamic State is the Islamic way and is the end goal of Islam, we were not silent. Similarly here, when people are hijacking what is jihad, a core tenet of Islam, means to us as being violent, we will similarly not be silent. That's why we are proud to oppose. In my speech, I'll talk about 4 things. First, framing and responses. Second, why is it that we think that moderate Muslims ought to do this now? Third, why do we think that the term of jihad must be protected and can never be whitewashed? And lastly, how do we deal with terrorist groups with regard to the perspective of a moderate Muslim? So let's go into first framing. There are 2 things I want to talk about. First, what is it that a moderate Muslim is? And I think this is a key component in this debate. So a moderate Muslim is an individual that has got a few identities. So you can have an identity of what your nationality is. For example, you can be a Malaysian or it can be a French, but you're also connected to what your identity is as an Islamic person. Meaning to say, you're not someone that is wholly conservative. You are an individual that is more likely to give unbiased opinion, someone who's more receptive towards comments, you're open to things like criticism, you're able to balance the rights that are being discussed here, and you're less defensive when it comes to discussing the idea of Islam in itself. Why do you think this is important? It is important because in terms of the context how Islam is portrayed, you are the individual that is best placed in a position for people to listen to you and take into account your viewpoint. Second, what do we think the attempt to reclaim would look like on our side? So we think many things, right? So the attempting to reclaim can start individually with peer groups where these individuals explain what the term jihad actually means. It can go to things like interviews, talk shows, scholarly articles. Have we seen this before? Heck yes. During the 2013 incidents of like in the Europe when France and the bombings happened in France, we had the My Jihad campaign that went viral of individuals explaining what the term jihad meant. In Australia, after the bombings in the cafe, you had millions of ads being portrayed all over buses and subways of individuals who are Muslim on these ads showing that they are also moderates and not all Muslims are terrorists. We think these are things that have already exist. And the core reason as to why we think this is something that's important is because we must explain why the term of jihad is something that is in a modern day context, is something that is important to individuals. And we cannot just use this archaic version that it's always going to be about violence. Let's go on to argumentations. All responses integrated. First, why do we think modern Muslims ought to do this? There are 4 levels to this. So I think note 1, the fight for modern Muslims against individuals hijacking the term jihad is against 2 types of individuals. One, Islamophobes or extremists that exist that will try to take this term and try to coin it against you. Why is it that immediately post this conflict, it is important for us to take a stance? So a lot of the idea that came up from Prime Minister was 2 things. One, people are unable to understand because people are afraid. Second is that people want to distance themselves from what this term actually means. So I think here are a few pieces of characterization. Why do you think that is untrue? So while people may not be able to understand, everything is untrue because post-ISIS, when ISIS was a big thing, a lot of Google searches, the top Google searches were understanding what the Islamic State was about and what are the core principles of Islam and is this something that is antithetical to it. So we think people have interest and they're willing to go for it. But more importantly, immediately after this, we think it's important for you as a modern individual to not keep silent, because when you're silent, you're doing 2 things. One, you're showing acceptance towards that the term of jihad is to be used this way, and second, complicity. We think that at this point in time, it is much more difficult when all of these narratives are being hijacked by Islamophobes, and there is only one side of the story that's being explained, which is why at the peak of this moment, when people are hijacking all of these things, which is why modern Muslims must step in to explain and correct them as to what the term jihad actually means, right? But second, let's talk about airtime. So a lot of the nuance that came from the Prime Minister's speech was that you can't get a lot of airtime because you're a minority Muslim. Okay, I think first I want to debunk this. I think in the current 21st century, a lot of things have improved. You have by postings like ISIS, Boko Haram, or Taliban, there has been a lot more interest of media houses to discuss about it. Al Jazeera, which started off as one of the smallest media that focus on Middle East and also Islamic things, have grown to be one of the prime time news at this point in time. So we think airtime is something that exists. But if taking the case at the best, we think if you want to talk about airtime, is you get most airtime at this point in time when this is a hot topic because a bombing just happened. Which is why when you come in, media houses are more than happy to take in scholarly individuals, moderate Muslims to come and explain, to talk, to discuss, because they always want to have a different version of the story that exists, which is why we think airtime is something that's much better. But if you do it much later, which is why you lose any airtime that you would get. But third, I think this is the POI where we ask, at what point do you want to reclaim? And I think the PM gives such a dismissive answer of saying, oh, that's the fiat or the DPM explaining. No, you are the PM, you have to explain what the counterfactual is. Because if you try to reclaim it at a later point, a lot of harms that we happen. First, because the narrative has been compounded for a long time, people are sharing it on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, it's much more difficult for you to dismantle the ideologies that people have already formed. But it's better under our work, if at this point in time, before people form opinions and crystallize their thoughts, you are there for providing a counterfactual and counter narrative on what jihadism is. Because if you do explain it later, all of the things that you're going to do, even if it's the purest intent, will be seen as an afterthought, or that you're unwilling to deal with this side. So if at any point that you want to talk about at what point you want to take action, it has to be at this point in time. Second idea, why do you think the term of jihad is very much important? So look, the info slide gives 3 reasons as to why the concept is something that's important. But there are 2 additional things that I think that's important in this info slide. One, the concept of jihad applies to you as a Muslim individually and also Muslim with regards to society. So your identity of being a Muslim in status quo is something that's very much difficult. Within the 21st century, there are a lot of Islamophobic states or things like discrimination where it's very much difficult for you to be an Islamic person. Because it's very difficult for you to explain to someone, why are you praying 5 times a day? Why are you fasting? Why is it that you can't take alcohol? And there's so much biases and temptations that exist, which is why for an individual Muslim, the term jihad is very much important for the individual. Is that a person would be able to deal with any and all hardships that a person faces, and also the idea of congregation, where they can deal with any other Muslims, for them to congregate and to talk about why is it that this notion is something that's important, why is it that all the struggles they go through, there is a bigger purpose there, and that the struggles of being an individual Islamic person is something that is real and people can deal with it. Because the harm that it accrues is that the moment you don't take it back now, I think you can never reclaim it. And this is harmful not for this generation, but also future generation, because people can just label any and all terms of jihadism, even if you use it later on, that all Muslims are terrorists and things like this. So this should push to things like maybe underground practicing of it, or that you're unable to practice it. I don't think it's true that you can say you can practice it individually, because at some point in time when people want to practice it open, that's when these people will be shunned upon. We think that's a worse world for Islamic individuals. Third, let's talk about terrorist group and their support. So in status quo, terrorist group oftentimes use a lot of Islamic terms, Islamic ideologies, Islamic verses to bring Islamic people to their side. So when they keep using these things, a lot of individuals who are unsure or lost will be drawn into it, which is why moderate Muslims must step in to say, this is not what Islam is about. This is not what jihad is about. Islamic State is not the way to go. Violence is not something that we condone anymore in the 21st century. These are the counter narratives and counterfactuals that must be put out there, and it can only be done by moderate Muslims, because these are the individuals in that position to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, the term jihad is very important for the Islamic community. At the point in which you abandon it is a point in which that you denounce and you harm Islamic and its theories in and of itself. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. All right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I just want to talk about is how people would react to the attempt under their set of house. Because Ops case seems to be contingent on this claim, because if people expand the label to the moderates, then all of the benefits don't apply under their set of house, but the harms that we talk about apply. There are 2 reasons as to why this is not going to be perceived in a good way. Number one, we argue that in general, people do not know about this concept and they cannot understand the complexities behind tenets of religion, particularly at a time where there's mass hysteria. It is a context of confusion. It is a context wherein like irrationality rules over rationality. We would argue, particularly because this jihad and claim the concept of jihad does not necessarily exclude terrorism, because it says, sometimes you can use force. That is the point at which this will be the target of mass sentiment, as opposed to, people actively supporting this context. For the reason that people are more likely to be risk averse, particularly in the instance in which people believe that there's a massive risk upon them in a context in which a terrorist attack has just happened, weeks ago, for example. But secondly, let's look at media's incentives. And I think this is important because the opposition side seems to, kind of assume that modern Muslims have some power in being able to vocalize their opinions in the first instance. We would argue the majority of media in these contexts are likely to be owned by the majority, for example, the white people, for example, people who are not Muslims. In this instance, we would argue these media organizations are overwhelmingly more likely to cater to what the majority believe. For example, that is because of viewership. For example, that is because of sponsorship. So to the extent they think and they agree with us that people have overwhelmingly racist ideas against Islam, for example, in terms of Islamophobia, we would argue that the immediate incentive, the overriding incentive that media organizations have is fear mongering. This is particularly important for politicians as well. For example, it buys into the mass narrative that this is a massive attack on their country, and therefore we should take an active stance against these Muslims. And that's why simplistic narratives that we talked about is likely to rule over the media at the expense of all of the nuances and complexities that the opposition side wants to get across to all of the people on the ground. I think this engages with the two reasons that they gave from their side of the house as to why people are likely to perceive this in a good way. Number one, their argument was people have interest, and that's why they research about these topics. But let's put this in context, right? If it is the case that this country was literally targeted by an attack, which is the visual definition of what aftermath of terrorism is, we would argue that it is more likely that an average individual who is not necessarily academic, for example, who is not necessarily really intellectually curious, for example, is likely to prioritize fear, is likely to prioritize self-protection at the expense of nuances. They have no incentive to look at what these people say because the word jihad has been hijacked by the terrorists, which is their claim. And if that is true, people have absolutely no incentive to listen at the point at which they hear the word jihad, because it's a trigger for these individuals. But secondly, they say it is hijacked. That's why this is the time to do it, because you get airtime. But this doesn't engage, because the fact that people talk about terrorism doesn't necessarily mean they talk about moderate Muslim. In fact, we talk to you about majority and why they have incentive to look at the most extreme types of terrorists, the most extreme types of Muslim ideology, as opposed to one that is moderate. If this is the case, you're unlikely to be able to create any change. Rather, you're more likely to receive the label of terrorism, because that is the narrative that exists, that is the overwhelming incentive that people have in this context. And that was why people were not able to perceive moderate Muslim ideology in an accurate way, which is the opposition's case and the premise of their case. Now let's move on to why their claim that Muslims are already seen as terrorists and be demonized. Anyway, I'm going to clarify what the delta is on two different levels. Firstly, the type of perception that people have under both sides of the house is fundamentally different. Because under their side of the house, the types of videos that you see, the types of promotion you see of, for example, ISIS, for example, it is literally one that depicts these people as terrorists. It is photos with guns in their hands, for example. It is photos of people looking like a criminal, because that is the perception that people have on the ground. That is the perception of radical Muslims that people have in the West. But this is worse, because the image that you're going to perpetuate through moderates voicing out about this issue is people, for example, that looks exactly like your neighbor. It is the people that you see in school, because they're unlikely to hold guns, for example. They're more likely to frame themselves as moderates. And that is the moment at which you extend this radical perception to the moderate people who live in the West, for example, who live in not so radical context in the first place. So there's a massive expansion in terms of the idea of extreme radicalism under their side of the house. That is particularly damaging for the people who have no association whatsoever with terrorist attacks in the first place. But secondly, in the status quo, even if there's some amount of discrimination that exists right now, I would argue that the scale of hate crime is extremely limited. That is for the reason that people don't fully believe that their neighbor is a terrorist, because they obviously interact with these people on a regular basis. But this one obviously gives the confirmation that it is the confirmation that these people might actually be related to terrorists, because people are more likely to perceive the idea of jihad and jihadists, for example, in a simplistic manner. So it is not just mistreatment that you get under their sort of house. It's likely to exaggerate. It is likely to lead to actual hate crimes, for example, that actually target these people for crimes, as opposed to maybe some soft kinds of discrimination that might be comparatively tolerable compared to hate crimes. Secondly, let's engage with their claim that this is a core belief of Muslims. And the first thing I just wanted to note is that this was an extreme assertion that comes out from their side of the house. There's no attempt at proving why this is actually true. But firstly, it's unclear why understanding was absolutely necessary, because oftentimes religions can be practiced within communities. For example, you share your ideas with the people that follow the same religion. I don't understand about Muslims, I don't understand about Christianity, but that doesn't mean you treat them in a bad manner in the first instance. So I don't understand why you need full understanding within society in the first instance. So the margin of decrease in terms of the practicing of religion is particularly low. But secondly, I would argue that this is a more urgent concern, because obviously this is a time frame problem, right? We would argue that it's more important that you protect your religion. It's more important that you don't exacerbate the image of your religion in this particular moment. Also, for the reason that it is oftentimes the premise of Muslim beliefs to be able to be practiced into the future as well. If people associate you with terrorist attack in this moment, that is the moment at which they're more likely to remove mosques, for example. You lose the ability to practice religion in non-term under their sort of past, and that was why there was. Before I move on, yes.
So under your same logic, if at this point in time, there's a narrative that's going on that all Muslims are terrorists and Islam is a religion of hate, as a moderate Muslim, will you stay silent?
Yes, because firstly, for you, your life matters more. But secondly, you have absolutely no obligation to the extreme Muslims that are fucking over your image. Obviously, because you're not consensual to that action. They do it, just for the sake of their ideology. You have no relation whatsoever to them. That's why I think you don't have obligation to do this. Rather, you have an obligation to protect your self-interest. But lastly, let's weigh on comparatives. The first thing I want to note is that this difference in scale is actually matters a lot, because even on the outside of the house, we might have things like discrimination against migration, for example. You might restrict things like people coming in from other countries, but that is fine, because what they have under their sort of house, and this is the crucial point in this debate, is that this extends to people who are most proximate to the ones that have this ideology. These are people who live in the Western countries. These are people who live in the communities within these people. These are the most likely to be the target of the most heinous of all crimes, and that was why the scale was massively different on the outside of the house. But secondly, I would argue that people are just more likely to be able to understand these narratives once the irrational period is gone. And that's why in long-term, people are more likely to be able to believe in our narrative if they think it is important under their side of the house. They say, you need to do this prior to confirmation bias. It's contradictory because they think that Muslims are already seen as terrorists in the first instance. Therefore, propose.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Full disclosure, I'm not a Muslim, but as a person living in the Muslim majority country, I see the struggles of all my Muslim friends who constantly have to justify why their religion does not condone violence. And that misconception happens because every time a person sees the word jihad, they associate it with having to wage a holy war against all other religions out there. I think you lose the critical ability for you to voice out the minute that when there's full coverage on this instance and you give it up. Because note that government so far has ignored or has not provided any reason whatsoever how they're actually able to combat this. They only say that you will stay silent. But at what point do they attempt to then justify or negotiate with the very same person that they say are condoning this form of oppression, radio silence on it? And this is where they're going to lose this debate. Panel, I'm going to add 3 forms of arguments. The first is why the life of a moderate Muslim will be much harder the minute you abandon the concept of jihad, which is something the Deputy Prime Minister say is okay. It's not an obligation to follow that core tenet anyways. Secondly, why in the perception of jihad, there's a different range of what you can do. Most of the time, it's a personal struggle. But I'm going to explain to you why when you don't reclaim that, it actually is a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby the most extreme version of jihad will be then practiced. The last thing on just other auxiliary practical benefits. But before that, let me rebut to DPM and PM, because this has been a super disingenuous house, and I'm going to tell you why you lose that airtime. Note, the first thing on the dismantle is the ability for you to get media coverage. What they're saying is that you will distance yourself and eventually people will come to understand. But this is also the very same society the Deputy Prime Minister said that no one has an incentive to do research. Therefore, I'm going to fill in the gaps that Deputy Prime Minister did not do. Who necessarily are the ones that are going to voice out for you? Is it going to be the conservative Muslims? No, these are the people that will not get any credence because people will view them as biased and therefore unreliable narrators to be able to defend in a very light manner. Therefore, even moderates won't necessarily want or find it palatable to listen to conservative Muslims. The moderate majority who are perhaps your allies, these are the majority, they will necessarily want to keep silent because they are not the subject matter experts on jihad. Therefore, if you don't voice it out, there's literally no one that's able to represent you or be able to be the person that fills in the radio silence. Not government literally say we should stay silent and not do anything to concept that. The difference is that it's not as if you stay silent, people will forget about it. What will then get flooded in the media are the most disingenuous portrayals from 2 parties. A, the Islamophobes, or B, the extremist Muslims who will then claim that they are the ones that do this in the name of jihad. Both of these counterfactuals can only be challenged by a moderate Muslim, so I don't know how opposition is able to challenge that later on. But let's go further than that. What they're saying is that, the media won't give you coverage. If the media doesn't give you coverage, the debate essentially cannot function. The debate has to assume that there's some form of media challenge, media coverage that's given to you, and therefore, whether or not do you stay silent or do you actually continue on? And I think that leader of opposition gave you a good idea about why there are already a lot of media there. But taking their case at best, even if all big media houses are biased, look, this is the 21st century and 2021. The media is super decentralized. There are many abilities for you to voice out. A, social media, B, India media houses. All of these are abilities for you to be able to voice out. The difference is with all these avenues that's available to you, a moderate Muslim in their world will still stay silent. Lastly, I say, what they say is extremely true, that people will not have the incentive to research, precisely because the average person has no incentive to research. The only time ever that they will get the idea of what the word jihad is during the actual coverage of that particular terrorist attack. Meaning that post-conflict, what a lot of media houses will do is that they'll invite both sides because they also want to be perceived as having a sort of neutrality, which is why they'll invite moderate Muslims in order to come there and explain to the layperson what jihad actually means. This is the prime ability for you to then tell them that jihad is not terrorist attack, and terrorist attack is something that all Muslims ought to condemn. Their version of jihad is the personal struggle that basically meant that living as a Muslim in the 21st century. So I think at worst, the debate won't change, because if a government is saying that there's no media coverage, then there's no ability. But the debate has to function that if you have the ability to change, do you take this opportunity? Lastly, they say, perception of radical Muslims are already there. I tell you, the Islamophobes will already believe in this. And the context the government seems to be debating in are the most extreme places in the Bible state whereby people already have a preconception that's formed. We tell you that the preconception is only formed because it goes unchallenged. In the instance where you actually tell people what these things are, even if these people are still inherently biased, they are less likely to be able to act out of those or solidify and agree with the extremist version of that idea. So lastly, I want to point out this idea of jihad because they say that it's assertive to claim that it's a core tenet. If you look at the info slide, it clearly says that there are 3 different ways of how you can actually practice those struggle. So no, it's not a core, it is not an assertion. But worse, we say that why it's important is because the ability for a Muslim to practice and pray 5 times a day, the ability for them to wear a hijab, the ability of them refrain from consuming pork and alcohol are all jihad and are all their ability to struggle to stay relevant. In a world where you don't allow jihad, it's a world whereby they will be forced to abandon these concepts and they will not be able to justify why they need to follow these practices. Go.
So you assert that Muslim media exists, which you don't substantiate. But even if that is the case, the audience is extremely limited to people who already understand Muslim. What is your delta?
No, people who already understand Muslim knows that this is not jihad. This debate is about the people who don't understand Muslim. The only time that they will get is when they are covering these terrorist attacks. Do you then allow them to say jihad as the main idea of why they're doing this and this is extremist form? Or do you allow a Muslim to necessarily correct that misconception? That is the debate, Tota. Moving on to my arguments, life as a most moderate Muslim, I will tell you that currently a lot of the ability for you to practice jihad is the ability for you to have carry on visible markers of practices of your Islamic faith. For example, wearing a hijab, for example, refraining from consumption of pork and alcohol. This is a world whereby the core tenet of Islam is something that your side is abandoning because they're saying that it is not important. But what we're saying is that it's super important because it literally is the entire identity of how you practice. Now you're twisted by the Islamophobes and also the extremists into not being able to carry out those abilities. So it's untrue that you can just stay silent. The world that they're living in is that people don't understand the concept of jihad. Muslims don't defend their ability to practice jihad, meaning that a lot of times when people force them to take off their hijab, they won't have to do so because the concept the government is sending is that you ought to remain silent and you ought to be continuously practicing inside, even though a lot of the internal ideas of what Islam is already lost. The second idea is the extreme form of jihadism that we practice. Look, that the debate already the info site already tell you there are 3 different types of jihad. And I think the concept of holy war is the most extreme form of jihad that's only practiced in medieval times because they were under constant threat of existence. Meaning that in a world whereby you don't allow them to practice easier forms of jihad, for example, the ability for them to wear a hijab, the most contemporary and moderate form, what happens is a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby you tell an Islamic person that they are not allowed to practice their religion. What this means is that the most insidious extremist form of radicalism that will now seep towards the individuals that were otherwise moderate will materialize more because they're telling them that it's so difficult for you to live, and this is the moment where force is necessary in order for you to live your life as a Muslim. In our world, where we reclaim the idea of what jihadism is, you will never have to display the most extreme form of jihadism because we will have a mutual form of understanding and tolerance of Islam. The last is potential benefits. Look, in their world, extremists will still use this to justify their actions. What we do is to dilute that ability, to tell people that this is not the form of jihad that ought to be practiced. Panel, I think government does nothing in order to challenge the misconception. We are very proud to take this debate.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the government whip.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll take POIs in the chat, but if it's like 5 minutes, 45 seconds-ish, and I haven't recognized your POI, feel free to vocalize. Yeah. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech. Firstly, can Muslims reclaim this word? Secondly, is it worth reclaiming in the first place? Firstly, can Muslims reclaim this term? So they only have two mechanisms here. The first mechanism is that, people do research. Firstly, this is an assertion. They don't give any mechanism for this. But secondly, we told you that the majority of people do not do this because at the aftermath of a terrorist attack, you're extremely scared. You're extremely looking for things like comfort and simple solutions about why this terrorist attack happened, why your nation was in danger, etc. So they're unlikely to read things like difficult articles or the entire page of like Wikipedia about what jihad is and how there's a spectrum of Muslims, etc. It would likely run to the easiest narrative that is peddled by things like mass media, that jihadists are bad and that they are evil, right? But thirdly, even if they do things like research, there's no guarantee that they research with the right sources, right? We think that things like tabloids, things like mass media, etc., are far more capable of creating simple and sensationalist type of rhetoric that these people are more likely to buy into. So even if people did look at articles on their side of the house, they're likely to look at the wrong type of articles and therefore end up having the wrong conceptions of jihad. But the second weird thing they said was that, there's things like Muslim media, right? Firstly, this is an assertion. I'm not sure why this exists and to what degree these media influences are powerful, etc. I would argue that the majority of people like do not read Al Jazeera. It's an extremely niche example. But secondly, I would argue that they're extremely limited in number and influence for the reason that firstly, obviously these Muslim media has significantly less resources compared to big networks like CNN, etc., that are controlled by white people. So that means to have like, it's more likely that these big networks have things like better content, they have things like better graphics and camera work, etc., to the degree that they have more money. So the majority of people watch those sites as opposed to these media Muslim sources. But secondly, at best, the only people who watch these Muslim news sites are Muslims, right? Because things like what is happening in the Muslim world, etc., is not relevant to the average white or like the average, non-Muslim person's life. So it's only people who already are interested in Muslim and have understanding of Muslim ideology that watch this in the first place, right? So if they tell on a Muslim network that jihadism is good, these people already know that. You're not affecting the people that you actually need to affect, i.e. the non-Muslims that are discriminating you and have all these misconceptions of jihad, right? But then they say that, but you don't solve that in our side of the house as well. Firstly, I just want to know it's not our burden to solve this, right? We don't have to solve misconceptions of jihad at the point where we can reduce discrimination of Muslims. And I would argue that's a far more important benefit, right? But secondly, we give you tons of mechanisms about why we were able to actually change it, right? The fact that you're able to differentiate yourself by saying that they are jihadists. Jihadists are not part of us. They are not associated. We do not share ideology in any sort of way. So you're actively able to differentiate between the extremists and the moderates. You're also less likely to be misrepresented because there are clips of you saying that jihadists can be good. The concept of jihad itself is a part of Muslim and really, really important, right? Notice that the comparative we support and we clearly laid out to you, it's not the silence that they misrepresent our case to be. It is active things like criticism and distancing ourselves from the term jihad, which means that it's not like the narrative is going to be, hijacked on our side of the house, right? I know that this is quite important because in either side of the house, I suppose that moderates will try to claim that Muslims should have rights and that they should not be discriminated, etc. But it's uniquely on our side of the house when we don't associate ourselves with jihad, we don't associate ourselves or defend jihad in any sort of way, that people lower the mental barriers that they have for listening to these people and they actually open up their ears and actually listen to the messages that these moderates are actually not that bad people, etc. Whereas in their side of the house, when the first thing you do is say that, but jihad is not that bad, that's when people shut off their ears. They're unwilling to listen to the other sort of messages you have about Muslim discrimination, etc. That's why discrimination gets significantly worse on their side of the house. But the second point is then jihad worth defending in the first place? And the first thing I want to engage with is a weird point about how this is going to increase recruitment for ISIS and Muslim terrorist groups, right? Firstly, I would argue that this is not mutually exclusive. You can all those lose this by saying that jihad is bad, that you should not engage in jihad, and therefore you should not join ISIS or join these terrorist groups or engaging in jihad in the first place, right? If moderate Muslims have so much influence over Muslims as they themselves characterize, they can, and if they can control things like interpretations of what this jihadism is, they can obviously just say that jihadism is not part of Muslim, therefore you should not opt into into terrorism in the first place. But secondly, it's likely to be worse on their side of the house, right? This is for the reason that for the average Muslim, right, I would argue that mass media is the thing that you're more likely to access for the reasons I gave above, that the mass media is more influential, that it's on more channels, that it has more resources, therefore better programs, etc. Right? So to the degree that the average Muslim who's uneducated about things like doctrines, for example, cannot really tell the difference between the Muslim and the jihadists and whether these things are separate and whether to what degree is like jihadism actually a part of Muslim ideology, etc., that's when they might believe that this terrorism is legitimate in some sort of way because it is following the ideology of jihad. And moreover, they don't engage with those guys' analysis that terrorists are likely to co-opt this narrative and say that, look, the moderate Muslims are supporting us, therefore we are representative of the Muslim ideology, and therefore we should opt into us, right? It's actually worse on a significant more level on their side house. They failed to engage. I'll take a POI now.
So if the average white person can believe your version of what jihad means, why is it that they won't be interested to understand the actual version of jihad, which includes the other two limbs?
For the reason that we already gave you. Firstly, because of confirmation bias and because people want to be told that jihad is just absolute evil because that's what they want to believe. But secondly, it's just difficult to understand like what jihad is. I don't really understand from the info slide. It's so nuanced, right? It's just easier to believe jihadists are bad, Muslims are bad, that's it. So that's why people are more likely to be compelled. But let's engage with their main case about how this is like the concept and the word of jihad is important in the first place. And what if we take them down? We take the entire case down, right? Firstly, it's unclear why the term jihad was important in the first place because there are other concepts, right? The fact that you're protected by the god Allah, the fact that you have other sort of cultural practices that bring meaning and help you overcome your struggles within the Muslim religion. I'm not sure why jihad was the only way in which these people could overcome these sort of struggles that they have. But secondly, I'm not sure why jihad provides comfort in the first place, right? Because it just obligates you to follow the Muslim lifestyle and obligate it to follow Muslim doctrines, etc. Like if you are suffering, it doesn't alleviate your suffering. It just says that despite the suffering, you should still follow Muslim beliefs. So I'm not sure why it actually provides any sort of comfort for these people, right? But thirdly, and most importantly, right, I'm not sure why individuals need approval from moderate Muslims to practice jihad in the first place, right? Because reasonably on a private level, without labeling it as jihad, they can still do things like pray, they can still do things like practice jihad, i.e. doing things like cultural and religious actions, etc., right? So to the degree that the average Muslim person can still practice this on an individual level without labeling or associating themselves with jihad, I'm not sure why approval from moderate Muslims was a tipping point at which these people lost all faith, etc., right? But fourthly, I would argue that even if we take them at their best, right, I would argue that the right to do things like wear a hijab or burqa or wear your favorite clothes or do things like, pray or not just be fear of death every single day is a far more important benefit, right? Because at best, we lose one side of religion, one aspect of religion that is jihad, but what they have to trade off is all other aspects of religion practice, right? Things like wearing your clothes, things like praying in public or doing things like religious festivals to the degree that people think that, you're discriminatory, like to the degree that people have much more negative perceptions of what Muslims are and conflate them with being much worse individuals. You get that oppression of all the other cultural aspects in their side house. So simply on the scale of like religious freedom that we provide, we outweigh them, right? Notice that even if the majority don't understand jihad, they can still understand that you need to pray. They can still understand that, you need cultural practices, which is why we're able to co-opt this in our side house. For those reasons, we have comprehensively taken this debate.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the opposition whip.
May I check if I'm audible?
You are audible.
All right, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government whip said that their burden is to prove that there will be less discrimination for the Muslims of the world. But their mechanism for that is to stay silent. That is allowing the homogenization of all the media that they characterize to say that jihad is a fundamental tenet of Islam. And as a result, the people who consume this media then feel that my neighbor could be someone who could be a terrorist one day, that my neighbor could be someone who could attack my children one day. Staying silent doesn't change narratives. You allow these prevalent narratives to hurt Islamic individuals even more. Either that, or you abandon the narrative, which is also their mechanization. That is to say, this is the worst thing for a Muslim person to do, because minorities face some form of discrimination doesn't mean that we should fight. Doesn't mean that we should stay silent and accept it, especially when it's something as fundamental and intrinsic to you as your religion. They say jihad isn't a fundamental tenet, but if you notice, all the Muslims abstaining from certain activities that they want to do, all of them clothing themselves, are the exact ways in which they represent their identity and show that they are a good Muslim. But they say that this is not an important tenet. tenant. Either way, they did not prove their burdens whatsoever, and they will lose. I'll talk about three issues. The first in terms of mass media, second in terms of can we change minds, and thirdly and more importantly, why this is damn important for Muslims around the world. The first thing I want to say is that they stated that the mass media is biased. And I would say that it's symmetrical in both worlds, because if mass media is really shit, it's true for both sides. So people will remain angry. What are the additional benefits that we have? The first is that we shift discourse. That is to say, in their world, they allow the curation of echo chambers. So even if people don't watch Al Jazeera, they still watch things like CNN and BBC. And we say why we need to react immediately is because it's interesting for mass media to have different perspectives of this particular opinion. Not only Fox News exists, right? And this is when the radicalists or the right-wing individuals who are Islamophobic can easily just say that all Muslims are horrible. They allow these people to go unchecked. In our, at least there's some individuals who consume this media, which could be right or left-wing, but at least there's a counter-narrative for people to do. The second thing, and why this is important, is because we help people do research. So instead of reading an article or going to your own volition to read research, you're watching the news and you just hear, oh, that's not really what jihadism is. If people are interested, you read more. If they're not, at least they have some form of counter narrative. In their world, they have none whatsoever. The second thing I would say is that their whole premise is just that media is biased, but without regarding the fact that media can exist outside of mass media, but also in social media. And this isn't a weird rebuttal that we have or niche rebuttal. A lot of times right now in the 21st century, social media is like the forefront of where information is gathered and discourse arises within these areas, right? So that's when we can also attack. So if you have no airtime in the mass media whatsoever, we can utilize this and have the My Jihad campaign or hashtags like this. What they would say to this is that, oh, but you're only telling it to people who agree with you. But that's the beauty of what mass media and social media is, because some right-wing people or some moderates will be able to watch this report. Some people in their own echo chambers in social media might have a moderate retweet this particular tweet saying this is something that's interesting to read. The point here is we don't have to prove that every individual will stop becoming Islamophobic, but the point is at least one more individual understanding what the core tenet of Islam is means that you don't have to forego your fundamental principles, and secondly, there'll be less misconceptions of you. The last thing that I want to say is that they assume that everyone is right-wing and conservative and they don't give a shit. The point here is that moderates exist, and not all moderates want to just hate Islam to begin with. They just have misconceptions because there is no counterbalance, because side government stays silent. In our world, moderate individuals will be able to identify different nuances of this particular religion. They say it's complex. It's really not. Jihadism is going through suffering. Suffering includes abstaining from certain things, and we denounce and Jihad isn't the holy war, which was something that was a thing in the past. It's not that complex anymore. It was simplified in info slide, and most of us understood it. The second issue I want to talk about is, can we change minds? They said that the public sentiment is negative and people are terrified. This is exactly why staying silent is worse. The reason why is because everyone knows that jihad is a tenet of Islam. So when you stay silent, you allow the homogenization of all Islamic individuals to be people who should be afraid of. This means that your physical markers, like your hijab, like your burqa, you associate yourself with this radical form that Islam is so scary because of jihadism, because jihadism is still something that remains in the scripture of Islam. What is the comparative here? Actually, no, I don't want to go to comparative yet. So they have to deal with individuals wearing these physical markers that they're Islam and people homogenizing them as radicalists. This is why the Islamophobia in France is insanely high, because of the homogenization and a lack of a counter narrative. What is the comparative? We think reclaiming allows you to disassociate yourself from this particular thing. This is not our version of Islam. This is not the contemporary interpretation of jihad. Maybe it was a thing in the past. Note that we don't have to prove that everyone will buy it. We just have to prove that some individuals who are misinformed and want to correct themselves buy it. Because in our world, there'll be one less person voting for banning hijabs. In our world, there'll be one less person discriminating their neighbors or discriminating their employees who are Islam. The next thing that they said is that, oh, but what are the sources? You might not be able to have research because it's the wrong source. Yeah, we are the source now, guys, because in your world, you only have skewed versions of what jihad is. You only have versions of brave people like the white individuals who don't have to face discrimination, telling and characterizing what your religion is. In our world, we have various sources, and at least our sources, there are some that are accurate and some that can normalize this particular thing. The last thing they say is complex. It's really not, and I've proven it just now. why is this important? Because they seem, sorry, I need to finish this issue, sorry. So the last issue is, why is this important? Because no, they took the burden to say that we'll just forego this element of jihad. The first thing we would say is that it is a tenet, and overwhelming negativity from people who discriminate shouldn't translate into you foregoing something as intricate as your faith. Even if you don't prove to anyone whatsoever of what jihad is and why it's something that's moderate in contemporary society, they say that you can practice it in your own community. There are two problems with this. The first is that some Muslims don't have the privilege of understanding different variations of what jihad means. At least now these Muslims are able to navigate the complexities of it and choose to be moderate. The second thing that we would say is that telling people to practice it in private or in your own communities is the worst thing to say about individuals. A lot of times, religion isn't only something that's personal, but something that you want to share and something that you want to be comfortable with. You want to walk out and feel like you're not discriminated. So the conclusion here is, the trade-off that you can practice it by yourself or in your own community is not enough whatsoever. The comparative note is that you stay silent. And in the 21st century, when most people are open to discourse, most people are interested in nuances of different thought processes and beliefs, we think that at least some individuals will be more comfortable. Some people will misrepresent you. And as a result, as a proud Malaya debater, I'm very proud to oppose.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, thank you very much. As is customary, I'd like to reverse the speaking order and welcome the opposition leader.
Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. People don't look at you as a jihadist. They look at everyone as a Muslim. In a world where you don't explain to these individuals who are unaware of what the difference is, they will then think that all Muslims are radical jihadists. That's the world the government is living in, and that's the world that we don't agree with. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we are clearly taking this debate. The first is that will you be able to be heard, and how will you change the minds of people? The second is that why jihad is a core tenet of Islam and something that government refuses to engage in. The third are the actual impacts that you have that government again just brushed off and said that there are other ways in order to combat that. But before that, I'll give you 2 technical reasons why government has already lost this debate. The first is that even if the burden of their case is on harm mitigation, there's literally no harm solvency on why they can actually achieve that. Note that we have given you structured analysis why if you stay silent, likelihood of things getting worse are there. They have never engaged to it, just saying that, oh, but at least we are silent and distance ourselves. No analysis whatsoever. The second is that there's a general lack of engagement towards the arguments that came from our side. We think all 3 speakers before me gave you good reasons as to why things will actually get better if you reclaim. All they said was 2 words: assertion and hyperbolic. So I don't think those actually qualify as engagement, and they actually needed to do better. Now, my first clash is, will you actually be able to get heard? Government has a pivot that I want you to notice. The first is that Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister said we will stay silent and therefore we'll distance ourselves. Government whip then pivoted to say we'll actively denounce it. So I'm unsure as to which one, but let's take both of them. So we think that when you stay silent, it does not mean that people will remain neutral. There's already a very pernicious counterfactual that's already existing. That's existing from 2 parties, the Islamophobes and also the radical jihadists who are claiming credit for the terrorist attack. Meaning that this will then be the idea that people use to associate with what Islam is practicing. Therefore, that form of jihadism will exist in both worlds. The idea is, how necessarily do you minimize the damage that's been done by that harmful narrative? We tell you that the media airtime is only happening in our world post-terrorist attack, because that's the only time that people will give you an airtime to actually talk about at most. So we think, therefore, in their word, the government agrees with that. Maybe Muslims won't get that much airtime. This is precisely the only time where you get airtime. But we also challenge that claim that say it's not true. We tell you that media is very much decentralized now. You have social media to be able to do. Heck, you even have Al Jazeera, which apparently, according to government, is an Islamic media. No. So we tell you that people, exactly because they won't do research, the only ever contact that they'll get with the term jihad is when mainstream media are reporting on it. And that's the prime time that you will have moderate Muslims to be able to reclaim their word and tell them that jihad is not associated with terrorists. All those people who are using jihadism in order to carry out their atrocious acts are actually not Islams and should be persecuted. That's the only ability that we have. Government loses that golden time frame. The second is that jihad as a core tenet. Government literally said A, that is not a core tenet. Later on, they say that you should move away from it. And then I want to tell you, we've given you structural reasons as to why your personal struggles as a contemporary Muslim living in a world whereby all vices are there. It is actually a form of jihad for you to be able to defend yourself and carry on your normal life, to be able to pray 5 times a day, to be able to refrain from certain acts of consumption of pork and alcohol. We tell you that all these are jihad that you need to affirm for moderate Muslims to be able to carry on to live their life. What they tell you is that, we have other principles that can actually do the same thing. Firstly, this came from GovWhip. Secondly, never explained is actually assertive as to what these counter principles are. What we tell you is that if you don't reclaim this, the most pernicious form of jihad will be able to exist, whereby the only way for you to then live as a Muslim is to use force, because in those circumstances the government festered. It is necessary because you have no ability to live out your life as a Muslim otherwise. And the third argument on why we want is on impact. Note that radical extremism is something that government said, we can just tell people to not join because jihad is bad. Government expects you to tell a Muslim that a core tenet in their religion is bad, and somewhat that's convincing enough to stray them away from radical extremism. We tell you that the terrorists are going to hijack it regardless, and they're going to reframe it, and they have a lot of propaganda to be able to reach out towards the most vulnerable groups of Muslims. This is the only ability that you will actually get to tell them that no, you can practice your jihad in other ways, you can live and coexist. Panel, I think what we have proven at the end of this debate is very simple, that jihad is clearly undermined by government, and that if you don't do it, other people will have their own take on it. With those things in place, I think it's time that Malaya gets the championship. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. To conclude the debate, I'd like to welcome the government leader.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2. The first thing I want to deal with is their implicit principle that underlies their case, the claim that as Muslims, you shouldn't stay silent. There are 2 reasons as to why this is irrelevant. Firstly, we told you at DPM that you have absolutely no obligation to do this to the extent the hijacking is something that is outside of your control, presumably you have no control over this. But second of all, it doesn't engage with the stance that comes out clearly in PM, which is that we obviously do not stay silent. In short term, we're willing to distance ourselves and criticize the concept of jihad. And in long term, we're happy to enlighten people when things become normal, when people are not ruled by irrationality anymore. So that's out of the debate. First question I want to deal with is how do we challenge misconceptions? The first thing I want to note is that this is obviously not our burden, because obviously we have no burden to solve everything in the world. In fact, I would argue that this is a less important concern in this debate for the reason that there's obviously no direct harm upon you, that kind of derives itself from misconception. I don't think they explain why this is true compared to all of the attacks that we talked about, which is obviously intuitively more impactful in this debate. But secondly, assuming that misconception was an important thing in this debate, is it really important? The first thing I just want to note again is that I don't think opposition side attempts at impacting this anyhow in this debate. So I don't understand why this is important in the first instance or the scale at which it is important. But secondly, we told you that I think their claim is that jihad theoretically underlies many Muslim practices and tenets, for example, but it's unclear why the underlying tenet or the understanding of the underlying concept was truly necessary in order for people to accept religion in the first instance. Their claim, and this is a misrepresentation, is that you need to be understood by people, other people around you. But yes, but you can do that within your community, within your circle, was the first thing we told you. But again, it's unclear why people needed to understand the concept that underlies all of the theory, for example, in order for them to understand what is on the surface, for example. If people are still able to understand why praying is a necessary thing of Muslim. It was unclear why jihad was necessary in order for you to achieve this in the first instance. But lastly, assuming it is important, can you really change this on their sort of house? Firstly, obviously this relies on perception change, which I think they lost conclusively in this debate, because at best they might be able to, enlighten people who are Muslims already, who subscribe to Muslim media, or they might be able to enlighten people who are intellectually interested people, which I would argue is people who presumably would already have the incentive and the knowledge of understanding Muslims in the first instance because of the underlying incentive that opposition side depicts in this debate. But the comparative is far worse, because when people regard you, and the majority of people regard you as same as terrorist people, that is the moment at which they have an incentive to actively crack down on what you already have in the status quo, thereby depriving you of mosque, thereby depriving you of the right and ability to practice, which was worse under their side of the house. But secondly, we actually have better chance at doing this, because when this hysteria doesn't exist on the outside of the house in long term, people, and if it is true that people are generally interested, that is the point at which people are more likely to believe in what Muslims tell you. That is the moment at which people are more likely to show understanding towards you. And I think this is important, because opposition side has no argument as to why there's an urgent problem, why there was an urgency to tackle this problem, especially at this particular point of time when it is directly after and immediately after a terrorist attack. Which is why, if we're able to change this in long term, I really don't see why there's any delta under their side of the house. They say confirmation bias, and this is the only response. But I would argue, as per their claim, confirmation bias that Muslims are terrorists already exists in the status quo, because it's not like terrorist attacks have been ongoing for decades and decades on end. Lastly, let's talk about Islamophobia. Would people understand this narrative, which is the premise of their case? Firstly, we told you in the context of hysteria, moderate majority would be discriminatory as well, because fear rules, and jihad becomes a trigger which deprives them of the ability to understand jihad in the first instance. But secondly, we told you that no media would side with you because the overwhelming majority believe in fear, and there's an incentive to fearmonger as well, which adds to this particular incentive. Luke kind of shifts the narrative and says social media. I would argue the same incentives and same problems apply, because obviously you only have 140 words to describe your opinions on such a platform. What then is the delta? Because Luke also says this is symmetric. Firstly, I don't think he engages with the existing narrative and the expansion of that narrative to moderate individuals as well. They claim people, people believe that moderates are terrorists as well. We showed you preemptively at DPM as to why that is not true and why there's an expansion of the harm, which is particularly large scale. But secondly, under their sort of house, you might be able to convince one person who is already inclined to understand you in the first instance, presumably not the people who inflicts the most amount of harm on you, but what they least risk under their sort of house is the lives and the benefits and welfare of hundreds of people who exist in the Western world. I think we've conclusively won this debate on all of those grounds. Proud to vote.
Thank you both teams for an outstanding debate.
Thank you for the debate, Tokyo. Thanks, judges.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. So the judges will now be deliberating, and while that's taking place, we're going to have our post-debate commentary, which means we will discuss the round that took place. I thought it was a very engaging round. I haven't seen one with that many issues in quite a while. I mean, that's my personal take on it. For this one, we're actually going to be joined once again by Thea Madriliejo, who is one of our top scoring judges for the ADJ exam for UADC 2021. They're also part of the equity team. Hi Thea, welcome back.
Hi Nina, hi everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone. I know this may be a bit of a lull since we just had a very exciting round. So bear with us a little bit. We're going to be preparing a few things for the awarding ceremony, and we got to keep the hype up,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Best speakers of Asia, best judges. I can't wait for that.
Yeah, so basically what we saw here was a mix of different debate themes happening. So there was an issue, at least for me, when I saw the motion, I knew it was an issue about reclaiming language. It's also about religious purity, about community formation, and I was even surprised to see a lot of different angles on media coverage. So for me in particular, I'm the most interested in the language aspect, because reclaiming talks about what does a language mean for someone. Like, what does a word mean? Like, what specifically is jihad, right? Or what does it entail for someone to mean one thing and for someone else to interpret it another way? So Thea, what were you interested in as you were listening in the debate?
I think what interested me most was more on the perception part, like how we were able to get a change in perception, or how we were able to change the dominant narrative, which I found very interesting to hear from the teams, especially since this is, I feel, more of a debate on the impacts or the effects.
Yeah.
There's some principle, but it's also more of like how this will work and how this will look like in the future as well.
I mean, that's up to the debater or the judge, right? So, for example, I'm not one to discount principle. I still think it is a big factor, but I do understand that we are now leaning towards a more impact specific debate and impact related way of looking at things. I guess another question I want to ask you is, in terms of the exchange, which parts do you feel like were the most engaging or the most difficult to catch up with, right? Because honestly, like when you're dealing with the best speakers of Asia and a finals room, there's always going to be parts that are difficult to keep up with. So which parts did you feel like you were struggling to kind of tag along as debaters were speaking?
Okay, so I'm gonna be honest here. Like the latter half of the second of the exchange, I think people were getting too high level for me at some point. Like, okay, I'm struggling to catch up, but we gotta catch up. Personally, I feel usually as well in the debates I notice, latter half of the exchange is where it starts to get really juicy in terms of like the engagement and teams starting to prioritize which parts of the case line they think is the most important one given the evolution of the debate. So I think it's a natural outcome that teams would want to gravitate more towards being very heavier and more rigorous in the second exchange. But the first speakers were great. I enjoyed listening to their mechanisms.
Yeah, I feel like a shout out should be given to all the speakers in the round, right? So for example, I think the first speakers were really good at the setup. So that's really the most difficult thing with a motion like this, like discussing what the priority should be. And then when everything gets thrown around, the second and third speakers have to organize everything while at the same time engaging with all the important parts. So seeing all of that happen, it's kind of inspiring, kind of intimidating, like, right? Like I wouldn't want to go against these particular people, but at the same time, I want to be them. I don't know if I fear them or want to be them. And I feel like that's the best part about watching rounds like this.
Yeah, I don't know, because, at some point, they've knocked out all these other great teams as well. Maybe as a judge, my fear is like, wow, these are really great teams. And my fear is always like, do I give the best justice to the arguments that they want to give? But I think the great part or the great things about the final series in any out round is at some point, it just becomes more about what is important for the judges who see the rounds. Like, what do they value more and what is more persuasive for them to accept?
Yeah, so it feels like it's a little bit like a rhetoric battle. And we talked about this. I feel like I talked about this in one of the other commentaries as well. And if you weren't there for it, like we raised earlier today that rhetoric seems to be a factor that a lot of debaters miss out on, despite the fact that it plays such a huge role. For example, in this round, we saw a lot of people throwing around their personal experiences, and that plays a role, right? It shows an understanding of the topic. It shows like mastery of the discussions that you're having. And I feel like that's a skill that a lot of teams forget. And hopefully this final reminds individuals that it does play a big role and it should play a big role, especially in your training.
Well, I think some teams really just like the logical aspect. Yeah. But as a speech comm major, I'm a big believer in the rhetoric and the manner as well. Maybe it's just the oldie in me that's like, manner is still a big thing. And, unconsciously, we do tend to gravitate towards different styles of rhetoric. Some people may have like a very easygoing rhetoric, or some of them may have this really laser-focused, rational deconstruction of a round, which both of them are great, but they're variables in terms of how judge appreciates the arguments,
With that said, like, what do you feel about the fact that we're now debating mostly sitting down? Some people debate lying down, like walking around their rooms.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts about this. The funny thing about this is that I feel I miss debating standing up. That may be weird for some people, but I honestly think that debating standing up was the best thing about debating. Like all the crazy hand gestures you used to do, and now you just sit and you can just do this. You can look cool. But when it was still in person, you would do all these crazy things. You'd see people sit on the table or on the podium or like crumple up their papers.
Some people still do that. Like we saw a speaker earlier stand up while giving their speech. So I guess it's all personal preference. I personally can't do that in my space. It's too small. But I understand the appeal of why individuals would want to, right? It reminds them of a simpler time, a time before COVID. And I feel like that's all we're after. Anyway, for those who just stopped by, we're doing post-debate commentary. If you have questions or if you want to join our discussion as well and answer the questions I'm asking Thea, you can write them in the comments or unmute yourself if you have thoughts and opinions on the round as well. Or if you're shy about it, you can privately message me things you want to ask or things you want to say, In the meantime, we're just waiting for the ballots to come in. Robert, how are the ballots updates?
All the buttons are going the wrong way. We are still waiting on them to come in, but they are assumed on their way.
Okay, great. That's very exciting. I'm very nervous, actually. Like, I don't know the results of any of the previous rounds that I've been giving commentaries on. I don't even see the motions. I am just as surprised as everyone is when the motions get released. As I mentioned earlier, it's only Robert who actually gets to see the motions outside of AdScore. So I get to see it and I get to be surprised the same time everyone else does. So Theo, in the motion set, when I sent it to you, what were your initial thoughts on the topic? Oh,
Sorry, I was muted. I didn't notice that. I think my first thought was, ooh, a religion final. I haven't seen that in a while.
that's true.
And personally, I'm a big fan of religion motions. And my second thought was, oh no, a religion final. Because the interesting thing about religions is that sometimes religion finals, either you're unable to dichotomize the religion aspect from the pragmatic outcomes. You know, some people focus on, for example, the doctrines or perhaps the scriptures attached to the religions and don't really tie it back to the round at large. But I was so happy to hear the grand finals and everyone has had really great impacts. And I feel that this is a tough round, especially for the judges. So best of luck to the grands panel.
Yeah, I can understand why they're taking their time. Like, the difficulty with religions is that it's mostly up in the air, but in this round, everything was grounded. Everything had a connection to a particular group or the media or the government or the way people will perceive each other. And that's the kind of way that you should be debating religion in general, or the kind of way that you should be debating any kind of like high concept motion or motion that involves a lot of different theories and concepts and vague things or things that you would consider vague, like belief systems, right?
Yeah, I think the thing I really enjoyed about the grand finals was you can really see how strongly they mechanize these vague concepts, right? So for some of us, it's more or less a belief system that can be sometimes hard to translate into pragmatic action. But for them, there's really clear outcomes, and it's all of just which outcome is more likely or which outcome is better mechanized, that it becomes like, oh, okay, that could happen tomorrow or later. I don't know. It depends.
I mean, that also kind of gives a showing of how good a good info slide will work out for the favor of debaters. So I guess shout out to AdScore as well if you're here, for like such a clean set of motions. Like, everything had info slides, everything was well defined. And I mean, like, as someone who does a lot of AdScore ships, it's really difficult to craft motions, and let alone 3 of them, only to have 2 of them not chosen, right? So I'm not sure if you got the motion you wanted to have debated, but hopefully it was something that was enjoyable nonetheless. So Robert, where are we with those motions? Because I think we're about to wrap up this post commentary.
Still no ballots in, but there are 11 judges that poor DMG has to type into the Happy Cat, so it could take a little while, but I'll let you know as soon as they come in.
Okay, thanks. All right, I guess the last thing I want to ask before I let you go, Thea, is how was your experience with UADC? Like, we've had a grueling 8 rounds, and then we've had to organize and be equity and be orgcom for a bunch of the other rounds. Like, how was the experience managing over 464 people?
Okay, so first, I guess I want to thank a lot of the participants, probably most of the participants, for keeping, you know, the concerns relatively low. I felt the teams and participants were generally well behaved. So it's sometimes there could be some unconsciously bad behaviors, and you know, it's a work in progress, but I'm glad to report on the equity end. It wasn't too tough, unless, you know, it was like round 4, I think, of the prelims. You know, it gets a little heated, people are tired, and sometimes we may say things we don't mean, or we may perceive things in a different way. But otherwise, I felt that the experience was tiring, but it was really fulfilling. It's really amazing to see different teams all over Asia, a lot of them fighting tooth and nail every round. You see the dedication, you see the passion, and you see how much they believe in every speech they craft. And I think that's really inspiring to see. And I'm like really excited for the next generation of Asia's debaters.
yeah, like as someone who's kind of been here a while, I'm excited to let go and just let the next generation take its roots. I don't know, like I'm very excited and very hopeful for the next generations because, like, let's be honest, our generation had quite a lot of drama and a lot of limitations given that it wasn't online. And now we're seeing so many new institutions, people from different circuits joining different tournaments. So it's just an excited time for everyone's CVs and everyone's capabilities as debaters, you know?
Yeah, I love Asia. Asia.
And Asia loves you back there. So thank you so much for joining us for this post commentary. For everyone, we hope you had a great time. You can still ask me questions in help desk if you have any more concerns with this day. And we'll see you during the awarding, which should happen in a few minutes from now. So with that said, bye.
Bye.